and truly distinct honor and privilege for a number of reasons. One, of course, you may note from my bio that I'm from Canada and was at the University of Toronto where I was educated. More about that in a moment, but also had the great pleasure and privilege of serving for and with Bob Bergeron when he was president. So it's nice to be here, Bob, to be able to continue the conversations that we've had over many years, albeit in a different form, around the role of public education. It's secondly, I guess, a real honor for me to be here because although I currently, and you may be sort of surprised that a university president of a private university would care much about public university education, but in fact, before I came to the United States, to the University of Pennsylvania, and then subsequently to Johns Hopkins University, I spent my entire life basically in a public university, the University of Toronto, where I was a student, a faculty member, and dean for about a decade. And it's in that context I have a great deal of respect and affection for public universities and feel, quite frankly, the challenges that confront public universities today are profound and something that stands as a major policy challenge for the country. And indeed, it's in that context where I have to say, as someone who goes twice a year to Washington, the American Association Universities, the meetings with the presidents, where the 60 university presidents from across AAU meet. What is so striking, of course, is the very significant disparity in the ways in which public university presidents discharge their role as the way I get to discharge mine. And quite frankly, on so many different aspects of our academic missions, which command great time and energy on the part of university leadership, I find why I get to worry, as I think in truth a lot of private university presidents do, about the challenges of technology, diversity, how you protect the fragile disciplines, what we're doing in life sciences and so forth in light of federal funding trends, so just on a host of different issues. What's really striking is the extent to which my public university peers are spending an enormous amount of time in defense, spending time in state capitals, dealing with political leadership and not getting back to the core mission. And that's a problem in itself, but I think it's compounded by what you, of course, know well from watching trends not just in California, but indeed across the country, is the very rapid churn of leadership in public versus private universities. Private university presidents of AA universities, Carol, you'll be happy to hear this, turn over about half the rate that public university presidents do. Private university presidents' tenures are dramatically shorter than privates. And that kind of churn very often is not about performance, it's about highly symbolic politics that have found their way onto the campuses, and I think, again, take universities, public universities, off their core and very noble mission. So with that, let me, and in a lot of ways I'm going to echo things, not surprisingly, being the follow-on in this panel, that I'm going to echo some of the sentiments that, and insights that others have offered, but I think I'll offer a slightly unique perspective on this. Let me first say that what I've really been interested in over the last several years, and again, it reflects my experience both in public and private universities, is this whole issue of what is the distinct mission of public universities in contrast to private universities. And here I really want to focus on the peer group that I know best, and that's the AAU peer group. But what is it that makes public universities distinctive from private universities? How do we interpret our missions differently? And here, you know, just to jump to the punchline, what's really striking is in so many different dimensions of our missions, there has been very substantial convergence. We're starting to look a lot like each other in a number of different ways. Now, that's not to say that I'm a unrestrained advocate for privatization of publics, but it's only to say that to the extent that private universities in the AAU, again, that's a peer group I'm focusing on, have demonstrated a capacity to evolve their mission in a way that shows fidelity to core public values that have long been associated with public universities, it starts to call the question, if we can get to some of those issues with our governance framework, is it possible that public universities can be freed up a bit and adopt the same governance framework to discharge their mission? Because again, one of the things that is so striking to me, although a lot of the discussion today, it starts with Bob, is understandably focused on the resource challenges that public universities have. And that's important. And again, these trends that we've seen in terms of a steady reduction in state funding, particularly over the last decade since the Great Recession, all of that is important. In fact, Bob, I'm a little more optimistic, and I can say more about that in the panel, but why maybe I think there are mechanisms to reverse this funding trend. And I actually think it goes something to a more imagined role the federal government can play here. But be that as it may, so much of the discussion focuses on the funding side, but loses another key part of the story, which is that public universities have these very anachronistic governance arrangements that actually go back to a time where states were investing in public universities at a level where in the halcyon days, they were supporting 60–70% of the operating budget of the university. The average is now 23%. This is a few years old for public universities in the United States. There are many public universities in the United States where they are now operating with less than 10% of their operating budget coming from the state. 10% of their operating budget or less coming from the state. And you ask the question, should those institutions still be tethered to governing boards, which are chock-a-block with political appointees, where there's very obtrusive regulations on how the institutions operate in terms of union rules, restrictions on tuition, all sorts of approval processes around financial investments and so forth, things that in my world are basically remitted to not-for-profit boards that have attention to all these issues, but much greater flexibility in pursuing these issues, and again, without becoming these really controversial and incendiary sites for highly destabilizing political activism, where this is a good place for, in our very polarized world, critics of government to play out this story about how utterly irresponsible universities are, and to take it out on the public universities in a way that is really, really bad for the mission of these institutions. We don't, it's not that we're immune to criticism. We are. We get it from outside our institutions, and we get it from within our institutions in terms of our various estates. And we certainly have to respond to criticism, constructive and otherwise, on our boards, but it's of a different character to the level that we see in public universities in this country. So that as much as we talk about funding, we have to be having serious discussions. And I think, Carol, this is what you were gesturing towards, but we have to be having serious discussions about the non-financial arrangements that govern the aspects of public university mission. Let me just elaborate a bit, and maybe we can pick this up in the panel discussion. But this convergence thesis, which I have been arguing for over the last several years, is interesting. As I said before, it's interesting because it shows the capacity of, and again, when we say private in this country, private universities, by and large, what we're really talking about, and certainly exclusively in the case of the AAU, it's not-for-profit privates. And we're not for-profit institutions. We're not-for-profit privates. And so what's really striking is how these not-for-profits have, over the last several years, in a number of key dimensions, taken on more public regarding behavior. So, although the traditional rationale for public universities was about industrial policy objectives, the way in which a university can be anchored in the ecosystem of a state. If you look at today, Silicon Valley, MIT, the role that so many different private universities are playing in their states and regional ecosystems, the fact is that they are very much tethered to the economic development strategy of the state, and they don't differ fundamentally where they're present from what public universities are doing. That's something that's been quite marked over the last several decades, particularly with Bayh-Dole, where we got control of the intellectual property related to federal finance research. But in other ways, private universities have shown quite remarkable movement in terms of how they've grappled with issues of access, for instance. We are clearly, and I think this is a place where we differ from public universities, we clearly don't do mass education on the scale that public universities do. But in terms of pricing, it's amazing what's happened over the last decade in terms of the growth of financial aid for the least advantaged families. And in some cases, although, again, I want to acknowledge that Berkeley's really a beacon here along with UCLA in terms of public universities that have very significant Pell populations in their student body, 35%. But the fact is, if you look at most of the leading public universities, research universities in the United States, their Pell numbers in many cases don't look as good as some of the top private universities. So again, a moment of convergence. If you look at the role that a place like Johns Hopkins plays in our local community, Baltimore is clearly a challenged city with lots of social, economic, and other challenges. The role that we have played in the city, again, seeing this as a core part of our mission, in fact, turns out to be, I think, significantly more intense than many of the publics in our city in large measure because of a whole host of different constraints that operate on the public. So I'll just say, we decided about a year or two ago to change our procurement rules, our hiring rules, to focus on local procurement, local hiring, again, to try and very intensely use our economic leverage to bring more jobs to Baltimore. And my public university counterparts said, we'd love to do that, but the state doesn't allow us to target in that way. So again, another area where we've showed a greater capacity to get at public values and goals than, in fact, public universities in our midst can. I think another area where mass education is still something where, as was noted earlier, public universities educate four times as many students, undergraduate students, as private universities in this country do. But again, if we start to see, and it's not the answer to everything, so I don't want my observations here to be inflated. But it's clear that that the role that lead institutions like MIT and other areas have done in terms of providing open coursework and making going onto Coursera and other platforms to make their product available, again, it's clear that the privates have started to again understand their obligation to share their bounty. So those are ways in which private universities have become more public in character, and of course we know that public universities have in many ways started to take on many of the aspects of private universities. The retreat of state funding has forced significant increase in tuition levels, greater focus on private philanthropy. In some ways though, decisions in terms of enrollment of out-of-state students, the shift from from need-based to merit-based financial aid, again, trends that are quite significant in public universities in the United States. That's something that, has, to my mind, reflects a derogation of mission by public universities from what they have traditionally seen themselves at, but nevertheless, because of the crushing financial burdens, limitations on how the tuition mechanism is used, and other financial challenges, of course, not the least of which is state disinvestment, all of which have forced these changes in behavior. So just to cut to the punchline here, to my mind, this actually calls for a moment where I think there is a need for a new compact in public education in this country. I think it's time to see, as one looks for various ways to improve operating performance and agility of public universities in the ways that Carol and others have called for, I think it's time to look in a very hard way at the core governance mechanisms that operate on public universities in this country. If one looks at the highly politicized nature of oversight boards in public universities, look at the kind of, as I said before, very divisive political skirmishes that have placed public universities at the center. In all these ways, I think this is a moment when one has to see that this governance structure, not only is it dysfunctional, but it's so anachronistic relative to the diminished level of state funding that's being provided. It may have been defensible decades ago when 70%, 60% of the operating budget has come from the states. It is no longer defensible at the levels of funding we're here now. But more than that, it's not desirable given what I believe to be the case that not-for-profit governance with the stakeholder representation, and again, one can tweak this in a variety of different ways, but I think can show itself remarkably adept at respecting and vindicating public values in a number of different areas. I also think there's lots of scope for thinking about operating contracts, other kinds of MOUs between state and university that again can free up more flexibility for institutions and again start to call the question of how much of that regulation do we really need if we had good not-for-profit governance models in place. So this is, I can elaborate on some of these things if you like. I've done a piece that I don't know if it was circulated, Bob, in the past, but there's a piece that I've done where pulls a lot of this stuff together in the TIAA Craft Working Paper series, where these ideas are explicated. But the long and the short of it is, Berkeley, like other public universities in the country, leading research universities in the country, these are citadels of excellence. But as Bob indicated, these are fragile institutions. And I fear that we're on this path where we continue to take for granted these institutions. And so much of the debate has been on the funding side that we've, in some sense, obscured an appreciation that as important are these very, I think, antiquated and quite frankly dysfunctional governance and regulatory arrangements that must be changed if we're really going to ensure that a university like Berkeley, a great university, the great public university, continues to remain preeminent. Thank you so much.